socialism, capitalism. Okay, so I'm going to give you the real quick 5-minute bullet points. We're not going into we're not doing the full lecture here. So prior to the Enlightenment, go ahead. You gotta pay big bucks for that. Yeah, you do. That's a whole college course. So prior to the Enlightenment, most people lived their lives as servants, serfs, peasants, right? Oh, see, you're laughing. And the way it worked was, there was a king or queen or bishop or whatever, right? Shogun. And they owned everything. The lords and the ladies owned everything, even you and your family, right? You didn't own the land. You didn't own any of the products on the land, anything, right? And that's how people live their lives. So if they wanted to come in and kidnap your daughter and take all your food as tax, you couldn't really do much unless you wanted to revolt, right? And that was just how most people lived their lives. Now, what happened was in the Enlightenment period, starting around the 1750s-ish, a guy named John Locke came around. There are others, but we're just going to focus on him because our Constitution is based on his works. A book he wrote called The Second Treatise of Government. And John Locke proposed two ideas that were kind of revolutionary at the time. One was liberalism, right? And the idea of liberalism is, well, technically, everybody would be equal under the law. So the law would apply to the king and the queen and to the peasant, right? And under liberalism, he also comes up with the idea of capitalism. And the idea of capitalism is, well, you would have private ownership of your own things. So your person, your papers, your effects, your house, any land you owned, any business you owned, things like that, you would own that, right? So that was the idea that a lot of this country was founded on, and a lot of other countries were founded on. So in a capitalist system, the private business owner, the private owner, owns what's called the means of production, which is the labor, the land, all that stuff. So Lacey come work for me, and she would work and produce products. I would keep all the profit. I'd own all that, and I'd pay her a wage. Lacey wouldn't own any of her labor or the results of her labor. She'd just get paid a wage. I'd own it as the business owner, as the private owner. Okay, that's essentially capitalism in a nutshell. Along comes about the 1850s, Karl Marx and some others, and they come up with the idea of socialism, and Marx comes up with communism. We're not going to get into communism today because there's no time. The thing about socialism is Marx is saying, well, here's the problem, is you have the business owners, right, the bourgeois that own everything, and then you have what he called the proletariat, which were the workers, the laborers, right? And so the laborers are working to produce the economy, right? The means of production. They produce the means of production. They are the means of production, but they don't own any of it. And so what happens is if you want to be a successful bourgeois, a business owner, you're trying to keep wages low as possible because it cuts into your profits, right? So you're trying to suppress that as much as possible to maximize your profits. And so these people that don't really work or do anything, they just happen to own everything, control the means of production. Well, the means of production isn't controlled by the laborers who actually produce everything, and they get poorer and poorer until what eventually happens is you have a system where it was like before, where you have a small class of people that control and own everything, and a large class of people that own nothing and are broke, and they eventually revolt, right? So with capitalism, he's saying all you've really done is replace feudalism with a system of feudalism based around money, right? So Marx's idea, and a lot of these other guys with socialism and communism, was what if we redistributed the wealth so that the means of production was controlled by the proletariat, by the laborers? So in that system, yeah, we'd have the business, but Lacey would also have an ownership share in the business in a socialist system, right? Even if I created the business and hired her, she would have some ownership of the profit because it's a result of her labor, right? So if she's making me $1 million a year and I'm only paying her $10,000, I don't get to keep that $990,000 all to myself. Part of that $990,000 would have to go to Lacey as a business owner. but it would also mean she get voting share. So that's kind of what socialism ideally was to begin with. You don't really see it implemented that way today. It's still very capitalist all over the world. But what you're starting to see is countries like Japan or Sweden or Norway or a lot of the European countries starting to implement what they're calling socialist policies. And what that is we're increasing the taxes, especially on the rich, right? Mainly on the rich, to redistribute that wealth from the top to the government, and the government redistributes it to programs to the people, like free college, free public education, universal health care, right? Housing assistance, right? And so I'll tell you a fun story. When I was in grad school, I was a guy that was there from Sweden who was an exchange student. And Sweden has a lot of those policies where they have high tax rates on the rich, but college is free, healthcare is free. You get housing assistance if you're poor. You get food assistance if you're poor. I mean, to an extent, more so to an extent than we ever have done it here in this country. And we were talking about minimum wage. And he was like, "What's minimum wage?" He'd never heard of it. And I said, "Well, the idea is to try and raise it so that people aren't working poor all the time, right? But even then, it doesn't really work." But he's like, "What's working poor?" But I said, "Those are people that work 40 plus hours a week and still make under the poverty line." And he's like, "That's not a thing." I'm like, "Yeah, it is. For tens of millions of Americans, that's a thing. They work 60 hours a week and they still live below the poverty line. They don't make enough money to survive." And he was shocked because they don't have that in Sweden. And they don't have minimum wage in Sweden because they don't need it. Because once you have these programs in place, what they found is you don't really have poor people, and people can strive to work more and get educated and do the things they want to do, right? And then what happens is when the poor start getting raised up, they start asking for more money, and wages just go up. So the way rich people see it in this country is, well, that sucks because we're basically getting taxed on both ends, right? On one end, I'm a really wealthy guy. I have to now pay more taxes every year to pay for these programs for the poor. And now that they're not poor, they're going to want more money. So now I have to pay my workers more money, so I can't squeeze them for more profit. Right? So when they're bitching about socialism, that's what they're complaining about, is they don't want to pay higher wages and they don't want to pay their fair share in taxes. And I'll give you an example of the tax situation right here. So this is from Vox, and we're going to just do the first and last half of this real quick.
These 10 people represent everyone in America. This person on the left, she represents the poorest 10% of Americans. And on the right, he is the very richest 10%. So let's ask this group a simple question. What percentage of your income gets taxed? Most Americans pay multiple income taxes to the federal government and state governments and local governments. But a recent analysis by 2 economists added up all the income taxes. And when you do that, the data shows that poor people pay a very small part of their income to the government, and rich people pay more.
Okay, so that's true. That's absolutely true. But if you add in all the taxes that people pay, so they're starting to add in other stuff like corporate and property tax, estate tax, the big for payroll tax is a big one for most people that are in the bottom 90%, and consumption tax is the other big one. So watch how they add it all up together.
Let's say you're looking to buy a t-shirt. When you check out, you pay a sales tax, which is a percentage of its cost. And sales taxes apply to most things: furniture, toilet paper, laundry detergent. For some items like beer and gasoline, there are additional taxes that get incorporated into the price tag before you even get to the store. These are called consumption taxes. And we all pay the same rate on the things we buy, regardless of how rich we are. Now, you might think that since rich people usually buy more things and more expensive things, they pay a larger percentage of their income toward these taxes. But relative to how much money they have, the stuff they buy and the taxes they pay on that stuff take up a relatively small portion of their income. Meanwhile, everyone, even people with almost no money, needs to buy certain basic things to survive. And for poor people, Those basic things and the taxes that come with them cost them almost everything they earn. So if we chart how much of their income each of these people pays in consumption taxes, we can see that poor people pay a much larger portion. When we put these taxes together, suddenly we see a big change. The chart shows...
So as you see in the chart, the wealthiest pay less than everybody else, right? So when they whine about socialism, what they're talking about is, what a lot of people are talking about is moving back the progressive tax system, including consumption tax and everything else, to a level where it was back to where it was in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because back then, for the wealthiest Americans, the high marginal tax rate was over 70% for all three of those decades. And those are three of the biggest growth decades in this country. Granted, it didn't translate to black people and women, or Native American people or Hispanic people. But the idea is that we go back to that sort of system where we had before, instead of them having all these loopholes and being able to avoid tax, which is why it was funny to start with Donald Trump, who paid no tax in 2020. And the guy's allegedly a billionaire. And you have corporations that are paying less than 1% in taxes every year. And they pay low wages. Very low wages. Right? So the question is between capitalism and socialism, nobody's really advocating for full socialism right now. That's not really on the table. What they're advocating for is we need to raise tax and redistribute wealth. And that way we can alleviate poverty, which is better for the world economy and your country's economy as a whole, because you're now utilizing all of your workforce in the most positive way. That would be the argument for socialism. The argument against it would be, well, that's not fair to take this money from these rich people who earned it. But the question is, did they really earn it? Or was it just because they were rich? And part of that whole point of the tax system is to try and prevent what the founders of this country were trying to prevent, was a landed gentry, right? A royalty that ruled everything just by the graciousness of being born into wealth. So that would be the argument sort of for and against it. But you can't make that argument against socialism. So what do they typically do? They just say socialism's bad, socialists are bad, right? They never really get into what it is or what the idea behind it is. And then that way, when anything happens that they don't like economically, or somebody mentions taxes or anything, they can just scream, they're a socialist, they're evil. Just like that woman. I don't like that my kids are socialists. Well, how are they socialists? What is it that bothers you? She doesn't ever say it. I think they're evil because they're socialists. Okay. But that's not really an argument. So let's do this.